They trained until their hand bled. Then they trained some more. Not soldiers, not gladiators, not the legionaries you have heard about who marched 20 miles a day and built a fort every night. Something different, something rarer, something Rome only created when it needed men who could do things that ordinary soldiers, even extraordinary soldiers, could not. The bodyguard of a Roman centurion's elite unit was selected from the best soldiers in the best legion in the Roman army. One man in several thousand, chosen not just for physical capability, though the physical requirements were themselves beyond what most human beings could achieve, but for something harder to measure and infinitely more valuable. The ability to function perfectly when everything around you has stopped functioning. The ability to make the right decision in the fraction of a second between your commander's life and his death. The ability to absorb punishment, physical, psychological, environmental, that would destroy an ordinary soldier and come out the other side still standing, still thinking, still capable of doing the one job that mattered above all others. Protect the man in front of you, whatever it costs. How do you train a human being to do that? How do you take a soldier who has already survived the brutal selection process of the Roman legions, already one of the best trained fighters on earth, and make him something beyond that? The answer is a training system so demanding, so precisely calibrated, so psychologically sophisticated that modern special forces trainers, when they study it, recognize in it the same fundamental principles that underlie the hardest military selection programs in the world today. 2,000 years apart, the same system. This is the story of how Rome built its most dangerous men. Before we go inside the training, you need to understand what these men were protecting. A Roman centurion was not simply a military officer. He was the functional backbone of the Roman army. The legion, the primary unit of Roman military power, was organized into cohorts and centuries, and the century was commanded by the centurion. 80 men under one officer. The centurion was responsible for those 80 men's training, discipline, equipment, morale, fighting quality, and performance in battle. But that description makes it sound administrative. It was not administrative. The centurion was the man who stood at the front of the formation in battle, not behind his men, directing from safety. In front, first into the fight, the last to leave it. The centurion's physical courage was not optional. It was the foundation of everything. His men fought hard because they could see him fighting harder. They held their position because he was holding his. They trusted the formation because the most experienced, most capable fighter they knew was personally anchoring its most dangerous point. The centurion was identifiable in battle, deliberately, visually identifiable. His transverse crest on his helmet ran side to side rather than front to back like ordinary soldiers' crests. His armor was superior. He carried his vine staff, the vitus, the symbol of his authority and the instrument of his discipline. He was visible, conspicuous, recognizable from a distance, which meant he was a target. Every enemy commander knew what a centurion's crest meant. Every warrior who had faced a Roman formation knew that killing the centurion was the highest value tactical act available to them. Kill the centurion, and you create a leadership vacuum in the most disciplined military unit in the ancient world. You create hesitation, confusion, the fraction of a second of uncertainty that cascades through a formation and can turn a winning position into a losing one. The bodyguard's entire existence was organized around one fact. Someone was always trying to kill the centurion. In battle, obviously, but also on a march. In camp, during negotiations with tribal leaders. During the inevitable moments of reduced security that a campaign produces. Anywhere that a centurion's elevated profile and reduced protection made him vulnerable. The bodyguard had to be ready for every one of these moments. All the time, without warning. Without the specific preparation that makes ordinary human performance possible. This is what the training was for. Not to produce capability in controlled conditions. To produce capability that persisted under conditions that destroyed all other capability. Selection began before training. And the selection process itself was, in many ways, more revealing than the training that followed. The Roman army had a sophisticated internal assessment system. Centurions and tribunes were constantly observing the men in their centuries, looking for specific qualities that the army needed for specialized roles. The assessment was not formal or written. There were no standardized tests in the modern sense. It was the accumulated judgment of experienced officers watching men perform over months and years. What were they looking for? Physical capability was the starting point, but not the primary criterion. The Roman legions already filtered for physical capability through the basic recruitment and training process. By the time a soldier was being considered for a centurion's bodyguard, he was already physically exceptional. The question was not whether he was strong or fast or capable with weapons. He already was. The question was what happened to him under stress. Roman officers had a sophisticated practical understanding of human stress response, not in the modern neurological sense, but in the precise empirical sense of men who had watched thousands of soldiers perform under pressure and learned to predict, with considerable accuracy, how a given man would respond when the situation became genuinely dangerous. Most men, under sufficient stress, narrow their field of awareness contracts. They focus on the immediate threat and lose track of the wider picture. They stop processing information effectively. They make decisions based on fear response rather than tactical assessment. They become, in the clinical modern sense, cognitively impaired. A small number of men do the opposite. Under stress, they expand. Their awareness sharpens. They process information faster, not slower. They make better decisions when frightened than when calm. They do not narrow, they widen. They see more, not less. They become more capable, not less, precisely when conditions demand maximum capability. These were the men the centurions were looking for. They identified them through observation during battle, during emergencies, during the various crises that campaign life inevitably produced. A fire in the camp at night, a sudden raid on a foraging party. The moment when a formation begins to waver and individual soldiers are suddenly making their own decisions about whether to hold or run. Watch carefully in those moments. The men who move toward the problem while others move away from it. The men whose faces show concentration rather than panic. The men who, in the confusion and noise and violence, somehow have a clear picture of what is happening and what needs to happen next. Those men were noted. Their names were remembered. When a bodyguard position opened, those names were the ones discussed. The selection process could take years. You could not manufacture the quality that made bodyguard service possible. You could only find it in the men who already had it, and then forge it into something harder and more precise through the training that followed. The training compound was separated from a main legion camp, not by great distance. Bodyguard trainees remained part of the legion, remained subject to legion discipline, continued to perform their regular duties alongside the specialized training. But the training itself happened in a dedicated space, under dedicated instructors, according to a schedule and a methodology that was kept deliberately separate from standard legion training. The separation served a psychological purpose as much as a practical one. It marked the men undergoing this training as different, as engaged in something that other soldiers were not engaged in. This distinction was not subtle, and it was not accidental. The social pressure of being visibly set apart, of being watched by your peers, of knowing that your performance in this dedicated space was being observed and evaluated, was itself a component of the training. Rome understood the motivating power of distinction. The vine staff that marked a centurion's authority. The transverse crest that made him visible in battle. The decorations and awards that marked a veteran soldier's service. These were not decorations in the trivial sense. They were elements of a social psychology system that used status, visibility, and a human desire for recognition to produce behavior that purely material incentives could not reliably produce. The bodyguard training program used this psychology from the first day. You were being watched. You were being evaluated. Every performance, every failure, every recovery from failure was observed and remembered by the instructors who would determine whether you continued or were returned to your century. The watch never stopped. Not during formal training sessions, not during meals, not during the rest periods that were themselves, in a sense, evaluated. How did you recover? How quickly? What did you do with downtime? Did you sleep when you could? Did you eat what was available even when it was inadequate? Did you maintain your equipment, your weapons, your mental focus during the hours when no one was formally requiring you to do so? The answer to these questions separated men who were performing for evaluation from men who had internalized the standards. The bodyguard needed men who maintained the standard because the standard had become part of who they were. Not because someone was watching, because the alternative, being the man who wasn't ready when it mattered, was personally unacceptable. The physical training began before dawn. Not metaphorically before dawn. Literally. The first training period started in darkness, specifically. This was not sadism, and it was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was a deliberate exploitation of a physiological reality. The human body performs differently in darkness than in daylight. In darkness, one of the primary sensory systems that physical training normally relies on, vision, is significantly degraded. The body compensates by increasing reliance on proprioception, on kinesthetic awareness, on the internal sense of position and movement that does not depend on visual input. Training in darkness, therefore, served two specific purposes. It developed proprioceptive and kinesthetic capability beyond what daylight training alone could achieve. And it familiarized the trainees with the specific experience of performing physical tasks under degraded sensory conditions, which was precisely the condition they would need to perform under in night raids, in smoky battles, in the confusion of close combat, where the visual field is constantly disrupted. The pre-dawn session focused on movement, running, but not the steady-pace endurance running that standard Legion training emphasized. Interval running, fast, short bursts, rest, fast again, designed to develop the anaerobic capacity that close combat requires. The ability to produce explosive power on demand, recover quickly, produce it again. The distances and timings were precise. Not because Rome had modern sport science, but because the instructors had accumulated empirical knowledge over generations about what training loads produced optimal results and what loads produced injury and exhaustion that set training back. They could not explain the physiology in modern terms, but they had learned the same lessons through trial and error that modern exercise scientists have confirmed through controlled research. Not metaphorically before dawn. Literally. The first training period started in darkness, specifically. This was not sadism, and it was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was a deliberate exploitation of a physiological reality. The human body performs differently in darkness than in daylight. In darkness, one of the primary sensory systems that physical training normally relies on, vision, is significantly degraded. The body compensates by increasing reliance on proprioception, on kinesthetic awareness, on the internal sense of position and movement that does not depend on visual input. Training in darkness, therefore, served two specific purposes. It developed proprioceptive and kinesthetic capability beyond what daylight training alone could achieve. And it familiarized the trainees with the specific experience of performing physical tasks under degraded sensory conditions, which was precisely the condition they would need to perform under in night raids, in smoky battles, in the confusion of close combat, where the visual field is constantly disrupted. The pre-dawn session focused on movement, running, but not the steady-pace endurance running that standard Legion training emphasized. Interval running, fast, short bursts, rest, fast again, designed to develop the anaerobic capacity that close combat requires. The ability to produce explosive power on demand, recover quickly, produce it again. The distances and timings were precise. Not because Rome had modern sport science, but because the instructors had accumulated empirical knowledge over generations about what training loads produced optimal results and what loads produced injury and exhaustion that set training back. They could not explain the physiology in modern terms, but they had learned the same lessons through trial and error that modern exercise scientists have confirmed through controlled research. Not metaphorically before dawn. Literally. The first training period started in darkness, specifically. This was not sadism, and it was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was a deliberate exploitation of a physiological reality. The human body performs differently in darkness than in daylight. In darkness, one of the primary sensory systems that physical training normally relies on, vision, is significantly degraded. The body compensates by increasing reliance on proprioception, on kinesthetic awareness, on the internal sense of position and movement that does not depend on visual input. Training in darkness, therefore, served two specific purposes. It developed proprioceptive and kinesthetic capability beyond what daylight training alone could achieve. And it familiarized the trainees with the specific experience of performing physical tasks under degraded sensory conditions, which was precisely the condition they would need to perform under in night raids, in smoky battles, in the confusion of close combat, where the visual field is constantly disrupted. The pre-dawn session focused on movement, running, but not the steady-pace endurance running that standard Legion training emphasized. Interval running, fast, short bursts, rest, fast again, designed to develop the anaerobic capacity that close combat requires. The ability to produce explosive power on demand, recover quickly, produce it again. The distances and timings were precise. Not because Rome had modern sport science, but because the instructors had accumulated empirical knowledge over generations about what training loads produced optimal results and what loads produced injury and exhaustion that set training back. They could not explain the physiology in modern terms, but they had learned the same lessons through trial and error that modern exercise scientists have confirmed through controlled research. 20 minutes of interval work, rest, 30 minutes of load-bearing movement, carrying weighted equipment over varied terrain, including the specific terrain features that a Centurion's bodyguard was likely to encounter. Hills, water obstacles, rubble, confined spaces. Rest. Weapon work. The weapon work in the pre-dawn period focused on a specific challenge. The trainees fought each other in pairs or small groups, in very low light, with weapons that were real, blunted, but real in weight and balance and handling characteristics, not the padded training weapons that standard Legion recruits used. The injuries from this phase of training were frequent and were considered an acceptable cost. Not because Roman instructors were indifferent to their trainees' welfare. The medical care provided was serious and competent, but because they understood something that modern military training doctrine has confirmed. Exposure to controlled injury builds a specific kind of confidence that simulated injury cannot build. The man who has taken a real blow, felt the real impact, experienced the real pain, and continued to function, has knowledge about his own resilience that no amount of padded sparring can provide. You did not know what you were capable of under pain until you had been in pain. The pre-dawn weapon sessions made sure you knew. The primary weapon training occupied the middle portion of a morning, and this is where the bodyguard training diverged most significantly from standard Legion training. The Roman legionary was trained to fight as part of a formation. The phalanx, the testudo, the coordinated advance. Roman military power was built on unit cohesion, on the ability of 80 or 800 or 8,000 men to act as a single organism, with the individual's capability subordinated to the formation's collective performance. The bodyguard was trained to fight alone, or nearly alone. A centurion's personal guard was typically a small group, rarely more than 6 to 8 men. In a crisis, potentially fewer, potentially just one. Fighting alone against multiple opponents is a fundamentally different tactical problem from fighting as part of a formation. The skills are different. The threat assessment is different. The footwork is different. The use of weapons is different. The standard legionary's primary weapon, the scutum, the large rectangular shield, was designed for formation fighting. It interlocked with the shields on either side, creating a continuous defensive wall. Alone, it was still useful, but much of its design value was inaccessible. Bodyguard weapon training, therefore, spent significantly more time on the gladius, the short sword, used without the shield as primary tool, or with a smaller auxiliary shield that allowed greater mobility and individual threat response. The training drills were designed around specific scenarios. 1 man, 3 opponents, close quarters. 1 man, an opponent with superior reach. 2 men, protecting a third who was not fighting, who was the principal, the commander being protected, against multiple attackers from multiple directions. This last scenario was the most complex and was drilled obsessively. The geometry of personal protection is demanding. You must simultaneously maintain awareness of the principal's position, assess incoming threats from all directions, position yourself to intercept those threats, and communicate with other bodyguard members without taking attention away from the threat picture. The physical skill component of this was trainable and was trained to a high standard. But the cognitive component was harder. The ability to track multiple simultaneous threats, prioritize them correctly, make correct intervention decisions in fractions of a second, and coordinate with partners through minimal communication. This was the cognitive equivalent of performing complex mental calculations while someone was hitting you. This habituation is not a character flaw. It is a neurological reality that applies to virtually every human being. The question for bodyguard training was not how to eliminate it. You cannot eliminate a fundamental property of the nervous system. The question was how to train men to recognize it in themselves and interrupt it before it resulted in a lapse in protection. The stillness training sessions were simple in description and brutal in practice. The trainees stood guard over nothing for hours in conditions designed to maximize the habituation problem. Quiet environments, repetitive low-stimulation surroundings, the absence of any obvious threat. At random intervals, without warning, something happened. An instructor walked briskly past the guard position from an unexpected direction. A training weapon was thrown into the guarded space. A voice spoke a prearranged challenge from behind the trainee. The trainee's response, or failure to respond, was noted. Not the quality of the response. Whether a response occurred at all. Whether the trainee had maintained the level of active attention necessary to detect and respond to a stimulus that arrived without pattern, without warning, after an extended period of nothing. The men who could do this, who could sustain genuine attention through hours of nothing, who had developed the internal discipline to keep their threat detection active when every neurological signal was telling them to relax. These men were extraordinary, not because the skill was supernatural, but because developing it required a quality of self-awareness and self-management that was genuinely rare. You had to know when your attention was drifting before it had fully drifted. You had to catch yourself beginning to habituate and reinitiate the active scanning that protection required. You had to do this continuously for hours without external reinforcement because the absence of incidents during a guard period was not evidence that the guard period was low risk. It was evidence that nothing had happened yet. This training continued through the entire preparation period because it was not the kind of skill that reached a plateau and stayed there. It degraded without practice. The instructors knew this because they had learned it from the failures that preceded the development of the training program. Guards who had been excellent during training who relaxed their standards during extended quiet operational periods. The resulting incidents that those relaxed standards had produced. The stillness training was not about teaching a skill. It was about building a habit of self-management that persisted in the absence of external pressure, that persisted in the quiet hours when nothing was happening and everything was fine and the probability of an incident seemed remote, because the incidents never announced themselves in advance. Now let us talk about what this training actually felt like from inside it, because the description of training regimens can make them sound like they were experienced as optimization programs. They were not. You are 23 years old. You have been a legionary for 5 years. You have been through basic training, through your first campaign, through your first battle. You have seen men die. You have been in situations where you were frightened in ways that training had not fully prepared you for, and you had functioned anyway, which was how you came to be considered for this. The pre-dawn sessions started when the rest of the camp was still asleep. You had been asleep for perhaps 4 hours when the instructor arrived, not with a bell or a horn or any of the signals that normally organized Legion time. He was simply there, outside your tent, in silence. And when you opened your eyes, he was looking at you, and you understood that the session had already started. You dressed in darkness, quietly, quickly. Every second of fumbling was noted. The armor that took 3 minutes to put on in daylight took longer in darkness, and you were expected to get faster, not to be given light. The run happened in darkness over ground that was not smooth. You fell. Everyone fell multiple times in the early weeks. The instructors did not help you up. They noted how quickly you got up, how you fell, whether you instinctively protected your weapon's hand, whether you rolled rather than catching yourself on your palms and risking a sprained wrist that would compromise your weapon work. The weapon sessions in low light were the sessions where the injuries happened, not catastrophic injuries. The instructors were experienced enough to manage the risk, but the cuts, the bruises, the impact injuries that accumulated over weeks of training with real weapons in conditions where you could not see everything you needed to see. The pain was constant, not dramatic, crisis-level pain. The constant background pain of a body being pushed beyond its comfortable operating range every day. The specific soreness of muscles that had been worked hard the day before being worked hard again before they had fully recovered. The calluses forming on hands that had not had calluses in those specific places before. The bruises on forearms and shins from training impacts that your body had not yet learned to protect against. You ate whatever was available. The food in the main camp was adequate. Roman military logistics were sophisticated enough to maintain reasonable caloric provision most of the time. But bodyguard trainees were not given special provisions. You ate what the Legion ate in the time available between training sessions in the quantities that happened to be ready when you were hungry. Sometimes this was adequate. Sometimes it was not. And training continued regardless. This was deliberate, not cruelty, though it felt like cruelty on the days when you had been running since before dawn and the food at midday was sparse and the afternoon training was 2 hours away. It was preparation. A bodyguard who could only perform when properly fed and rested was a bodyguard who would fail whenever the operational situation produced hunger and exhaustion, which it would, reliably, in extended campaigns. You needed to know your floor. The level of performance you could sustain when everything that normally supports performance was absent. You needed to know this number precisely because in the moment when you needed to perform at that floor, there would be no time to assess it. You had to already know. The training was teaching you your floor by taking you there repeatedly under controlled conditions so that when you arrived there under uncontrolled ones, it was familiar territory. Sleep was the most psychologically difficult deprivation. The human mind tolerates hunger with relative stoicism. It tolerates physical pain with even more stoicism under the right conditions. Sleep deprivation is different. Sleep deprivation is insidious. It degrades cognition before the person experiencing it recognizes that cognition is degraded. It creates emotional responses that feel proportionate but are not. It produces a specific form of suffering, not the sharp, acute suffering of pain, but the gray, grinding suffering of a mind that cannot function properly and knows it, but cannot stop it. The bodyguard training included extended periods of reduced sleep, not sleep deprivation in the extreme sense. The instructors understood that total sleep deprivation produced impairment so severe that training became counterproductive. But the chronic partial sleep restriction that operational conditions reliably produced. For hours, 5 hours, 4 days at a time, and the training continued at the same intensity and the same standard. You discovered things about yourself during these periods. Most of what you discovered was uncomfortable. You discovered what your mind did when it was tired, what shortcuts it took, what threats it stopped noticing, what automatic responses degraded first. You discovered the specific errors that your personal cognition made under sleep restriction, which were not the same as your colleagues' errors, because the ways that minds fail are as individual as the ways they succeed. This self-knowledge was the point, not the suffering that produced it. The knowledge. A bodyguard who knew exactly how his own cognition degraded under stress could compensate for that degradation in ways that a man who had never been pushed to his limits could not. He could recognize the internal signals that preceded a lapse in attention. He could apply the specific self-management techniques that interrupted those signals before they became failures. He could not eliminate the degradation, but he could manage it. And managing it was the difference between a bodyguard who was reliable under all operational conditions and a bodyguard who was reliable only when conditions were favorable. Favorable conditions were not the ones that mattered. The stakes of failure in this training were not the abstract stakes of failing to meet a professional standard. They were the death of the man you were there to protect. This was communicated explicitly, not in an inspirational speech about honor and duty. In a specific, detailed, unglamorous briefing about what had actually happened to previous Centurions whose protection had failed. The instructors kept records, not formal written records. Roman military record keeping for this kind of institutional knowledge was oral rather than written, maintained in the memories of experienced instructors and passed to their successors. But detailed, specific records of incidents. What the threat, these cases were studied, not to assign blame to the men who had failed. In many cases, those men were dead, but to understand the specific failure modes that the training needed to address. The picture that emerged from these cases was consistent and sobering. Most protection failures did not occur because the bodyguard was absent or cowardly or physically incapable of responding. They occurred because the bodyguard had not detected the threat in time to prevent it from reaching the principal, because attention had lapsed at the critical moment, because a threat had been assessed as lower priority than it turned out to be, because the bodyguard had positioned himself correctly for the threat he anticipated and incorrectly for the threat that materialized. In other words, most protection failures were failures of attention and assessment, not failures of physical capability or courage. This finding shaped the entire training program. Physical training was necessary. You could not protect anyone if you were not capable of the physical demands of close-quarters protection, but it was not sufficient. The physical capability was the baseline that made everything else possible. The real training, the training that determined whether a bodyguard actually succeeded at the one job that mattered, was the cognitive training. The attention management, the threat assessment, the decision-making under stress. The physical suffering of the training was partly just the physical suffering that the role required, but it was also a delivery mechanism for the cognitive training. You cannot develop reliable performance under cognitive load unless you practice performing under cognitive load. And the most efficient way to impose cognitive load in training was to combine physical stress, which everyone responds to with some degree of cognitive degradation, with the assessment and decision-making tasks that the role required. Train your mind by training your body to its limits, then adding the mental tasks. If you can do it exhausted, cold, hungry, and hurt, you can do it in any operational condition. That was the theory. It was correct, and it was brutal. The men who completed the training and took their positions in a Centurion's personal guard were changed by what they had undergone, not in ways that were immediately visible. They looked like soldiers. They carried themselves like soldiers. They performed their regular legion duties alongside their specialized role. But something was different, something in the quality of their attention. The way they entered a room, automatically assessing exits, positions, potential threat angles, the specific configuration of space that determined where a principal was most exposed. The way they stood during rest periods, oriented, present, maintaining the baseline awareness that the stillness training had made habitual. They had internalized something that could not be taught in a classroom or produced by a training manual. They had internalized a way of being in the world that was permanently oriented toward the question, what is the threat here, and what do I do about it? Not anxiously, not with the hypervigilance of trauma, with the calm, competent, always active attention of a professional who had been trained to the point where the behavior was automatic. That transformation was what the training was for. Everything else, the running, the weapon work, the sleep deprivation, the stillness drills, was the process by which it was produced. Compare this system to other elite personal protection training in the ancient and medieval world. The Persian immortals, the elite infantry corps of the Achaemenid Empire, 10,000 strong, maintained at exactly that number by immediate replacement of casualties, were the most famous elite military unit of the ancient Near East. Superbly equipped, rigorously trained, psychologically significant as a symbol of Persian military power. But they were a formation unit. Their training was for formation warfare. Personal protection of a principal was not their primary function. The Spartan Agoge, the brutal educational system that produced Spartan warriors, created soldiers of extraordinary physical capability and unit cohesion. Men who had been training since age 7, who had been deliberately subjected to hunger, exposure, physical hardship, and the systematic erosion of individual identity in favor of collective identity. The Agoge produced remarkable soldiers. It did not produce personal protection specialists. The cognitive and attentional skills specific to protection work were not what the Agoge was optimizing for. The medieval knight's training, which began in childhood and extended through adolescence and young adulthood, produced martial capability of a high order. But it was primarily oriented toward cavalry combat and the specific skills of armored warfare. The systematic development of protection-specific cognitive skills was not a central feature. The Roman bodyguard system was distinctive in its explicit recognition that the primary demands of close personal protection were cognitive rather than physical. This recognition is so modern in its framing that it reads, when you encounter it in the historical record, like a contemporary document that has been placed in an ancient context by mistake. But it is genuine. The Romans had figured out, through the unforgiving feedback loop of operational experience, that the men who survived as bodyguards, who actually fulfilled the role over extended operational periods, who were still alive and still protecting their principals years into their service, were not necessarily the physically strongest or the most technically skilled with weapons. They were the men with the best attention management, the best threat assessment, the most reliable cognitive performance under stress. The training they designed was designed to produce exactly those qualities. Modern Special Forces selection programs, the British SAS selection, the U.S. Army Special Forces qualification course, the Israeli Sayeret Makel assessment, use different specific tests and different technologies, but are organized around an identical central insight. Physical capability is the entry requirement. What you're actually selecting for is cognitive performance under prolonged physical and psychological stress. Can this person think when everything is telling them to stop thinking? Can this person make good decisions when they are exhausted and hurt and frightened, and the information they need is incomplete? The answer to that question determines operational effectiveness more reliably than any physical measurement. The Romans knew this. 2,000 years before it became the founding principle of modern special forces doctrine. They did not know it because they were ahead of their time. They knew it because they had learned it the hard way, because they had fielded bodyguards who were physically superb and cognitively undertrained, and those bodyguards had failed, and the men they were protecting had died, and the lessons of those failures have been incorporated into a training system that was refined over generations until it reliably produced the specific human capability that the role required. This is how all genuinely effective training systems are built. Not from theory, from failure, from the careful, unsentimental study of what went wrong and the ruthless revision of preparation and response. So here's what the training of a Roman centurion's elite bodyguard actually was. Not a program designed to produce brave men or strong men or skillful men, though it produced all of these as byproducts. It was a system designed to produce reliable men, men whose performance did not depend on favorable conditions, men who functioned at an adequate level across the full range of operational conditions from ideal to catastrophic, men who had been taken to their limits under controlled conditions until those limits were known precisely and had been extended as far as human physiology allowed. The physical suffering was real. The sleep deprivation was real. The pain and the cold and the hunger and the exhaustion were real. But they were not the point. They were the medium through which the actual training happened. The cognitive training, the attention management, the threat assessment under load, the self-knowledge that made reliable performance possible when nothing else did. The system worked because it was honest. Honest about what the role actually required. Honest about what failure actually meant. Honest about the fact that the operational conditions that determined whether protection succeeded or failed were not the optimal conditions of a training environment, but the worst possible conditions that extended campaigns and continuous threat exposure produced. You trained in the worst conditions so that the worst conditions were familiar. You trained until the skills were not decisions, but reflexes with intelligence behind them. You trained until the awareness you needed was not something you turned on when you needed it, but something that was always on, that required effort to turn off rather than effort to activate. That is the system. It is elegant in its logic. It is brutal in its execution. And it is still, in its essential architecture, the system that the hardest military selection programs in the world use to produce the same specific human capability for the same specific reason. The role has not changed. The requirement has not changed. Only the names have changed. Here is the question the Roman bodyguard system leaves you with. Think about the thing you are preparing for. The challenge, the role, the responsibility that will demand the best you can produce. Not in ideal conditions, but in the conditions that you actually face. Tired, under-resourced, uncertain, facing problems that didn't show up in the plan. Are you training for those conditions? Or are you training in the conditions that feel productive, rested, resourced, prepared, in control, and hoping that the capability you build there will transfer to the conditions that actually matter? The Roman bodyguard training system was built on a single uncomfortable insight. Capability built in comfortable conditions does not automatically transfer to uncomfortable ones. You have to practice in the conditions you will face. You have to know your floor. You have to have been to your limits enough times that your limits are familiar territory rather than unknown country. The Roman instructors did not have a name for this principle. They had something better. They had 2,000 years of evidence that it worked. The men who went through this system and stood beside their centurions through campaigns across Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. The men who were still there, still standing, still watching, still capable, after months of the conditions that broke everyone else. Those men were the product of a system that understood something fundamental about human performance. You do not find out what you are capable of by staying within what you know you are capable of. You find out by going past it. Under controlled conditions, with instructors who know where the line between productive hardship and destructive damage is, with a clear purpose that makes the suffering meaningful rather than arbitrary. But past it, definitively, without exception, until the place you used to think was your limit is just another point on the range of conditions you can operate in. That is what Rome built. That is what the bodyguard training produced. And that, at the bottom of all the physical detail and historical specificity, is the lesson that 2,000 years have not made obsolete.